Is there any that you saw at your table that you really think should be shared with the entire group? Anything that strike you as... Yeah, Sharon.
Senator, meaning legislative aides. They're the eyes and ears of the senators.
Right.
And the senators can't possibly know it all. And one of the things we know is that the legislative staffers do more of the work than the legislators. If you can't get in the door to the legislative staffers, you have no shot.
Right. Yeah. And I found it. Okay, so let me just tell you what I did with these slips of papers. I color-coded everything according to the concepts that I had designated before, and I made like a concept wall. And I would put a category up on the wall, and then put everything that fit under that category so that I could kind of get the big picture of what people were saying, what they told me. And then, for example, the yellow one down in the corner is the policy change takes time one. I didn't know how else to make sense of everything. And I'm sure that you reading the things might make it different. Your perceptions might be different than mine. But I had the advantage of having sat there. I know. You guys don't. You're taking them out of context a little bit. I know how the flow of the conversation went. But any other ones that you think are worthy of sharing? There's some, yeah, Russ.
I think I could probably talk loudly enough. I guess not. we had one that stood out to us. We know politically opening up IDEA is not a good idea in a Republican-controlled Congress. And the reason it stood out to us is because it says the policymakers who are supposed to be looking at what is best policy for the country are looking at what is best politics for the time. The issue is not whether or not IDEA should be open or whether or not there should be changes. It's whether or not we should do it now because of who's in charge, which is a totally different issue.
Right, and that's interesting. It was interesting to me that somebody would admit that you can't do certain things depending on the makeup of the Congress. And you just have to hold everything until that passes. Until that Congress changes. There's no sense in even moving on that. A couple of them said, you know, if you really want to get something about libraries into the legislation, now is the time, because in 2 years it's coming up for reauthorization. I would never have thought that we had to work that far in advance. You know, and so I learned a lot. The people that have the libraries, you have some, Holly, that you want to read?
Yeah, we picked the one that we wanted to throw away first, and then I'm going to follow it with a very short one that ties into what Russ read. Do you really think libraries are important today? I don't mean to be rude or anything, but are people even talking about libraries anymore? In all the policy conversations I've ever had, libraries have never been mentioned. Which goes back to what you were saying. It may have been mentioned that they couldn't hold it in their head, or among the so many thousands we weren't getting a connection for it to be heard. And then I'll just follow it up with this. Libraries are very uncontroversial.
Yeah. And you know, what I found was that the legislative staff approached the questions differently than the disability advocates did. Disability advocates were like, libraries, huh? I would never even have thought of that. Literally, the first person I talked to said, you know, I said, are libraries on your radar? She said, no. I'm very sorry, I have never thought of libraries in terms of working with people with disabilities. The legislative staff were much more diplomatic. So you got the libraries are a very uncontroversial one. You got, nobody doesn't like libraries. But they're speaking as, you know, somebody that has to approach things more broad viewed because they're the eyes and ears of their senator. Because the senator can't know everything. All right, so it was very enlightening to me to see this sort of thing. So the next thing I did was, let's go to the next slide. So on your table, you should be getting word clouds. You should have file folder, you're going to get a file folder in a minute, that's filled with word clouds. So what I did, if you don't know what a word cloud is, the big words in a word cloud are the most frequently mentioned words. So you take text and you just plug it into this program, and there's a number of them online you can go to. I used a very, very simple one. And it makes the most frequently used words bigger. So in your folders, you're going to have a word cloud for each of the 6 concepts that I came up with. And they're different colors. And there's enough for everybody at the table to at least look at one cloud. I think there's 2 sets per table. So the words that jump out of you, in the purple one, ESA jumps out, disability community jumps out, because we were talking about ESA legislation, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Students jumps out, because almost everybody in talking about that sort of policy mentions students. But sometimes the fine print is more interesting than the big words. The things that people said that are just little snippets are sometimes more revealing than the big words. So just, kind of glance through them. The pink one is the fragmentation one that has a lot of words on it, but you'll see task force jumps out. And also in the orange one, task force is going to be something that jumps out. People in Washington said over and over, you have to work in coalition. You have to be on a task force. If you want library policy to be noticed, you have to be part of the task force for education. You have to be part of the coalition for human rights. You have to be sitting at the table when these things are being discussed. And if librarians aren't at the table, then they are not going to be on the radar of anybody. So let's go to the next slide. These are the 2 that have to do with timing. And so people gearing up a year, this is the year that this is happening, reauthorization. These are words that come up because these are words that have to do with timing of legislation and when people start working on it. In a year or 2, now is the time. When things are happening, you'll see words like that. When reauthorization, ESA, Republican-controlled Congress, again, in the green one. The opportunity for change occurs, but it also, opportunity might have to be held back because you know that you're not going to get anything passed depending on the makeup of the Congress. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, and here's the library framing one. And the way that librarians view libraries is very different from the way the public views libraries. And so it occurred to me when I was looking over my data that one thing that happened was they knew that I was there talking about school libraries, but to most people there's no differentiation between school libraries, they don't even know what an academic library is, I'm sorry to say, for those of you. Or it's either public library or school library. But everything's kind of merged into this one image in their brain of what a library is. So even though we were talking about school libraries, and that was specifically what I asked them about, very often the conversation morphed into what was going on in their public library. So in some ways that's good, if something good was happening in their public library. But I got a lot of this, are school libraries really necessary because we have technology now, we have iPads now. And I also, when I was in Washington, attended a couple events at a think tank, and those are open to the public, anybody can go to them, and one of them was on the future of libraries. So I wanted to hear what librarians in Washington are saying about their libraries. And their views of what libraries are were very different from what I was hearing from the policymakers. But just looking at this particular slide, the way that things were framed in this one, we have the libraries are very uncontroversial, quote. one of the think tank people said, I would highly doubt that you would find any congressman or congresswoman that would say that libraries aren't valuable. Most would spin you a story about their experience in a school library and how much they loved going to the library as a child. And I think that's true, that a congressman or congresswoman isn't going to say, I don't like libraries, because it wouldn't reflect well on them, but they might not put it on the top of their political agenda. And that's the problem that librarians face. And then the Education Week journalist said to me, and she was this was a casual conversation we had as I was walking out from an event with her. She said, you know, in my 25 years as a journalist, I have never been asked to cover libraries. And maybe libraries are so ubiquitous that we don't even notice them until they're gone. And she worked for Education Week. And she was very happy to talk to me, but just said, let me see if there's somebody else that knows something more about libraries than I do that could help you more. So that view that it should not even be asked to write about it, the media doesn't address libraries very often, is, I think it's reflective of where it is in people's mind. Okay, and then the next one, the big ideas. I'm just going to point out a couple things on this one because it's something that occurred to me that I think is just, I wasn't aware of. Congressional staff is very young. And I was taken aback when I talked to some of them because they were my daughter's ages. You know, I love my daughters, but boy, when I think about them making policy that I have to live under, that's scary. And it is scary. And congressional staff, there's a lot of turnover. They're in their 20s. They have high energy. And I mentioned that to the head of the ALA, who's a lobbyist. She's older. She's been a lobbyist for many, many years. She said they have to be young because it's such a high-paced, high-energy job. They're there from 7 in the morning till midnight, frequently. They just have to have that energy. But they don't have the experience to know what we know. I sat down with one of the legislative staff and she told me what her senator believes about certain things. And I said, you know, I'm sorry, but when I was in the field, that did not work. You should know that as a teacher for 10 years in this kind of school, that did not work. And I invite you to go to the school and see what's going on. But she's in Washington and she's 25 years old and she doesn't know. So when you think about that, I mean, I'm not being nasty or anything. It just worries me that the staff is so young. So one of the roles of think tanks then was to get the research to the congressional staff in a way that they could absorb it. They don't read peer-reviewed journals. So those of you who are academics that are writing these long articles for these, you know, really good journals that we all think are really important, the staff of your congressmen are not reading that stuff. They're reading sound bites and bullets and blogs and Politico and things that are really short. And that's what think tank people are trying to get them the data about and make sure that they have both sides of the story. Some think tanks are very biased, but some of them are more broad-minded. So just getting that information in a form that can be assimilated by the staff is really important. And that's something I wasn't aware of before I went there and talked to them and saw what was going on. Let's go to the last one. So just a couple things to take away from this so far that I've found. Librarians need to be in coalitions. We need to be at the table. The message is that none of us can do this work alone. That's what I was told by the policy people in the disabilities community, and I think it's true for librarians. We can't do what we want to do alone. We need to be working with a community of users and patrons and people who are concerned. The disability advocates are willing. They're willing to help fund us. One of the people that I talked to was from an organization that does do some grant writing, and she said, I'm going to see if there's a way for us to pull you in. They want to know what we can do for them. They're interested in seeing an article in their newsletter so that they can get the word out about what librarians can do for them and how libraries can support them. And they're willing to have us sit at the table with them. Go to the next one. And so again, the idea of the way we look at libraries is way different from the way the public looks at library. And on this slide, the top part is the way that disability advocates were looking at. In all the policy conversations I've ever had, libraries have never been mentioned. And one of the people said to me, I haven't had school libraries come up in terms of having them be, for example, a source of direct instruction. If you're not looking at your school librarian as somebody that's a teacher and thinking that they can help instruct your student, then there's a big disconnect between what we think we're doing and what the parents and people in the public think we're doing. But the librarians that I heard said one of the most important things librarians can do is become personal learning agents to help any person accomplish their own learning goals and their exploration of the world. And I think as librarians, we think that's what we do. And also, librarians were never really about the books, but about the information contained therein. A library is a space where learning can take place. The space is the service. And I think that that's what we're talking about here. We want to make our spaces accessible and open to people with diverse needs. And that's what we need to project out to the world so that every disability organization comes to us as a resource and realizes we have the space to help them serve their population as well. So it was an interesting trip. Go to the last slide. There's no reason why librarians can't be working in partnership with disability groups. There are people in Congress who are champions of disability. Part of the key is finding out who they are, making sure you talk to them and you get their support. And interacting with government is a very tricky process, somebody said to me. And yeah, I think so. So if you have questions, you can talk to me later, but is there questions anybody has right now? Yeah, Sharon. For example, Patti Murray, who is a senator from Washington, is a strong advocate of libraries. Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island is a strong advocate of libraries. He was a House of Representative member for many years, and then he became a senator. He has been trying to pass the library piece in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for years and years and years. The ALA. That's it. And the ALA, when I talked to the head of the ALA when I was in Washington, I said, why aren't you working with disability groups? It seems to me you two should be talking together and going together to Congress. And she said, well, they haven't given me anything that I feel like I can go to Congress with. Their agenda has been different than ours. So I think what needs to happen is our agendas have to kind of be blended a little bit better. And at least we have to be at the table with them so that they know that we're there. But if that's not going to happen, if that doesn't happen, peace doesn't happen, then we're in trouble. Other questions? Anybody else? Yeah, of course.
Just something to sort of support what you've been saying in terms of legislators can only hold a certain number of things in their head and groups need to work together in coalitions. I'll make it very local, Illinois. Many of you, all of you probably are aware of the fact that TAP was one of many programs that lost all its funding on April 1st by the governor when he suspended grant payments for a month. And we were frequently talking to legislators. I testified in front of I don't know how many legislative committees repeatedly and spoke personally with a leading member of one of the parties in the legislature who was very supportive of human services in general. And she sat on every committee in front of which I testified. And when somebody else spoke with her personally in June, after I had spoken to her probably a dozen times, she said, I've never heard of TAP. And TAP has been funded since 2003. So the importance of getting the message out frequently by a number of different people in a number of different ways is just huge.